So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Jeff Patterson. I'm an assistant professor of practice in the Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work department at Texas Tech University. The research I'm going to be talking about today focuses on QAnon, which I particularly studied on Reddit. Um, s- Background of my study. Uh, I imagine many of you are at least passingly familiar with QAnon, but just as a bit of background on it, it's an arch conspiracy, meaning it brings together a whole lot of different conspiracy narratives into nominally a single package, and it's named after its pseudonymous founder who posted on the social media site 4chan as a Q clearance patriot, claiming to have the Q level of clearance associated with the Department of Energy, which would give them access to top secret nuclear information. Q was one of several anons or anonymous posters on 4chan claiming to have some sort of insider knowledge, but he was by far the most, or they were by far the most successful in popularizing themselves. So QAnon was notable for its rapid online proliferation, attracting millions of supporters at its height. Uh, for example, there was a Facebook study that found thousands of pages and groups related to QAnon with millions of members. The core belief that's usually ascribed to QAnon is this assertion of there being a deep state cabal working to subvert the US government. However, Q themselves drew widely from existing conspiracy literature in their posts on 4chan, then later 8chan, and encouraged a proactive role of followers in knowledge creation. So making very vague predictions and encouraging their followers to come up with their own interpretation. So this gave QAnon a rather broad appeal, and due to all of these different interpreters presenting their own view of QAnon to various audiences, but it also facilitated the emergence of dozens of competing factions that were all centered on different interpreters. So I set out to do a study of contested knowledge, looking at how knowledge is contested both between movements and within movements. So this ended up making QAnon pretty well suited for that study. Um, so going through the methods of my study took place in the social media site Reddit, which I selected for it being a pretty large social media site that also silos discussion into specialized subreddits. So you'll have r slash and then some topic name, and that's where the conversations on that topic. So r slash conspiracy is where you talk about conspiracy theories. R slash knitting is where you talk about knitting. And so that was very helpful because then I could identify different trends within each subreddit. In an initial exploratory phase from mid-2020 to mid-2021, I identified knowledgeable pro and anti-Q informants that were active on Reddit. This resulted in 12 recorded semi-structured interviews across 9 respondents, as well as ongoing text-based communication with a few of my key informants as I continued to develop the project. So from these discussions, it became pretty clear to me that QAnon was not monolithic. So I ended up narrowing my focus to the Steinbartist faction, which my pro-Q informants belong to. So the Steinbartist faction refers to the faction of QAnon that was centered on Austin Steinbart. Um, he was notable for a couple of things. Most of his messaging focused heavily on technology and sort of science fiction type things, as well as he claiming to himself be this anonymous Q, or rather that he would be Q and was using quantum computing to contact himself from the future to give himself messages. A very interesting belief system, and it set it apart from several other Q factions, which became relevant later in the study. So combining my own investigation of the Steinbartist faction with advice from my informants, I constructed a list of key terms to identify Steinbartist-related discussions on Reddit. This yielded an initial data set of over 40,000 posts made between 2017, QAnon's inception, and June 2021. I picked QAnon's inception in 2017 as a conservative estimate. The earliest evidence of Steinbart's own involvement in QAnon wasn't until 2018, but I wanted to be on the safe side, so I went back to QAnon's inception. However, most of my posts naturally reflect his period of increasing involvement with QAnon, so 2019 on. Posts were sorted by subreddit with the up to 5 longest discussions sampled from each subreddit. So that gave me a total of 107 posts and all of the comments replying to those posts. The length of these posts varied from a few pages of discussion to hundreds of pages of discussion. All right, so I first conducted content analysis on the comment level. So I looked at every individual comment for key themes that were invoked by the commenter. And then I followed this up with conversation analysis of comment chains. So looking at how different users of Reddit responded to one another and debated ideas. This portion of the project allowed me to incorporate my research with past theory to develop a 3-step model of radicalization, which traces a particular converts from initial exposure to the messaging to them actually paying attention to the messaging, from that attention to them adopting or failing to adopt the beliefs that were encoded in the messaging, which results in differential closeness, where they draw closer to the people and groups that are involved in that messaging or in that movement, and then eventually action on behalf of the causes expressed by that movement. Because that first stage or that first phase of exposure to attention is the most relevant to the mainstreaming of extremism, I'm going to focus on that here. The other aspects are, of course, very interesting and worth considering, but because that's looking more at the individual extremist rather than the mainstreaming. I'm focusing on the exposure to attention pathway. So the first step in recruitment, of course, gaining the potential convert's attention. Simple exposure does play a key role in this, providing the logic behind saturation ad campaigns. The idea of if your billboard is on every corner, then even if people miss it the first 15 times, they'll eventually see it and pay attention to it. So during the period studied, again, 2017 to 2021, QAnon had a prolific online presence supported by overlapping networks of pro-Q content creators. And despite his relatively small following, Steinbart's faction was noted by my informants, especially the anti-Q informants, the self-described Q debunkers. The Steinbart faction was noted as being particularly active in self-promotion. And this does have some support from an initial quantitative review I did, showing that the Steinbart-related Q supporters were commenting at a much higher rate than comparative factions. So while this provided QAnon with significant attention from both sympathetic and oppositional parties, I did find many instances where the exposure to the messaging failed to generate attention. Most pro-Q comments in my data set received minimal engagement. This is actually why I opted for length-based sampling rather than random sampling. That of those 40,000 posts, the vast majority of them were simply a post with no replies to it. So I went for link-based sampling because I was particularly interested in the conversations people were having. And then when engagement did occur, it was often adversarial. Supportive replies were largely confined to the dedicated QAnon subreddits, such as the R. Steinbart subreddit that focused on, of course, Austin Steinbart. Whereas outside of those explicitly pro-Q or pro-QAnon subreddits, any engagement that Q posts got tended to be much more adversarial. So to explain this, I drew upon Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital as a moderating variable affecting the relationship between exposure to a message and the attention or lack thereof that it receives. QAnon was very successful in attracting the attention of lay audiences by appealing to broad and often contradictory narratives. So various Q posts would talk about immigration, racial tensions, class tensions, political scandals, climate, health, pretty much anything of concern. You could find a Q interpreter that was talking about that. And this provided Q-related messaging with a baseline of cultural capital among lay audiences. And that may explain the instances we saw of public figures sharing Q content, whether as elected officials, candidates running for office, celebrities, things like that, that Absent evidence that they were actually Q supporters themselves, the fact that Q-related content often drew upon these broader cultural narratives may explain the penetration of QAnon into the more mainstream. However, QAnon seems to have had comparatively little cultural capital in the dedicated conspiracy theory forums, such as R Conspiracy, which I studied pretty heavily. Despite lively debate being a norm in conspiracist subcultures, with page after page of debates on various conspiracy theories favored or disfavored by the discursants, Q-related content was mostly ignored or met with mockery. So when somebody did reply to Q posts in our conspiracy, rather than engaging with their substantive claims, it was usually to mock or dismiss. I also identified a number of counter theories that became popular among both self-described Q debunkers and traditional conspiracy theorists that alleged that QAnon itself was either scammers looking to make money or even a disinformation project by a vague yet menacing government agency. Likewise, claims generated by rival factions were largely dismissed by Q supporters themselves. For example, one of my informants, who was one of the most significant supporters of the Steinbart faction on Reddit, had a running feud with a promoter of a Christian-themed Q variant that focused on gematria, or biblical numerology. So you had the Steinbartist factions focus on high technology, with a rival Q faction looking at it from a more apocalyptic millennialist point of view. And they were more likely to disagree than agree, despite their shared affiliation with QAnon. So there were some limits, of course, that need to be addressed. So as an exploratory study, I was not setting out to test any particular hypotheses. I was actually caught off guard by QAnon. My background is in studying heterodox subcultures, so subcultures that are, for the most part, largely self-contained, dealing with fringe ideas, and not heavily involved in promoting those fringe ideas within the mainstream. And that was my initial intent with studying QAnon, because when I first started looking at it back in 2017, early 2018, it was just a 4chan thing. So I was caught off guard by it becoming such a mainstream aspect of fringe beliefs. And because this was an exploratory study, I was only looking at the single Q faction, the Steinbartists, and I was only looking at Reddit over a 4-year period. So there are, of course, limitations that come with that. And due to the nature of Reddit and the way we constructed the database, we wanted to ensure that the conversation was complete before we archived it. Reddit archives or locks the threads after 6 months from being posted. So we waited 6 months before archiving any conversation. As a result of this, comments or even entire accounts were deleted prior to archiving. So I have a record that a comment was made, but that it was deleted. So I don't know what the comment was. In other cases, I have comments, but the account was deleted. So it will say deleted account, but then I'll have the comment. So I could do content analysis on the comment. I could do conversation analysis in the comment chain, but I would be unable in those cases to look at the poster to see what other things they were posting or what other subreddits they were involved in. But there are still some notable implications for future research. QAnon was successful at mainstreaming fringe beliefs, but at the cost of a coherent doctrine and capacity for collective action. So while there were certainly Q-affiliated people at the January 6th protest, the Steinbartists themselves were actually more interested at the time in an SEC ruling on cryptocurrency, because Steinbart was a big supporter of cryptocurrency, than they were in the protest. In fact, one of my Steinbartist informants in the lead up to the protest described it as a nothing burger, and that nothing would come of the various claims about the election. That it was just not something that interested him at all, despite QAnon's popular association with the election and the various concerns there. And then QAnon started off in a conspiracist subculture, but it failed to maintain or build cultural capital in those spaces, like I talked about. That just mentioning QAnon and our conspiracy towards the end of my data set was enough to get you either completely ignored or laughed at. And this may have implications for its longevity as mainstream discourse moves on. That many of the mainstay conspiracies, moon landing, JFK assassination, 9/11, These have periods where they draw attention in the mainstream, of course, but they also survive within this conspiracist subculture. The fact that QAnon seems to have very little support among the conspiracist subculture may hinder its ability to ever have a resurgence once it continues to die down in participation. But time will, of course, tell. And then finally, the three-step radicalization model is initially supported by my exploratory qualitative findings, and it's grounded in established theories. So this will allow for further refinement and research beyond QAnon, and I have other projects along this vein that I'm developing. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you.